fertilization. I'm barely going to touch on grazing because Roger's going to do most of that. So some of the data I'm going to share with you came from Sierra Field Station or SFREC, and it came from this field which they call the Scott Field. To give you some idea of the topography, it's about 900 feet in elevation here, and it's about 700 feet elevation there. So it's a typical kind of foothill wild flood field. This is the irrigation system. Gated pipe, the water comes from the local irrigation district. They got a professional full-time irrigator. So I want to make that point real clear, that's taking care of this irrigation on a regular basis. I also want to acknowledge Dustin and wherever Nikolai is and Gary for the work they did with me on this project. If you're not aware of the SIMA stations, they're located across the state. California Irrigation System Management is what I think the acronym is, and what it shows you is what the crop demand is for water, and pasture is considered ETO, and so if you look at this graph, the y-axis is inches. The x-axis is month, and then I stuck several years in here. And this might come as a big shock to you, but irrigated pasture requires less water in the spring and more water in the summer, and then again less in the fall. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. You know, don't forget it's going to need a hell of a lot of water in June, July, and August, and less in the spring and in the fall. And I think that's a strategy to have in the back of your mind. For this project, we looked at, how much water are we applying, how much water is running off, and then how good a job is Gary doing irrigating. And we used watermark sensors, which are just these little probes, and they were in the soil 6 to 12 inches, and they measured the moisture in the soil. So without a lot of detail, just recognize that when we see 60 to 100 centibars on the graph, probably need to think about irrigating. And so you look at this, so this is how moist was that, how moist were those sites, was that soil at 6 inches. And so every place you see a spike, the field was getting drier, and where you see a depression was when Gary irrigated. And so it looks to me like he had worked pretty hard to keep that soil moist at 6 inches during the peak of summer, but when we got out into the fall, he was able to let his belt out a notch, and he was able to keep that soil moist. So kind of have that in the back of your mind. Call it late August or late September if you want. Here's how he did at 12 inches. That soil stayed relatively moist across the summer, but kind of keep in the back of your head that most grasses are going to have the roots in the top 6 inches. Some, of course, stretching down to 12. But again, you look here, late summer, early autumn, beginning to stay moist. So again, I think that's something to have in the back of your mind. I'm going to take a minute and explain this slide to you. Again, we have inches of water per acre, and we've got month. And recall, we measured all the water on, all the water off, and then we looked at ET. So this blue line shows how much water in inches was applied every single month on a per acre basis to that field. This red line shows how much water ran off. So it's how much ran down that little draw, and again, we measured it. This purple line, I'm going to skip the blue one for a second. This purple line represents how much water the crop actually needed, how much ET was based on the SIMA station data in inches, and then I just by difference calculated the blue line, which was the net irrigation. So when I look at this graph, it tells me a couple things. It says we applied about the same amount of water every single month. We ran off more water in the month of September. We over-irrigated a little bit over crop demand. What that graph tells me is maybe we got the opportunity to irrigate a little less in the fall. We can get by with a little less water. That's what that tells me. I'm going to show you another site from another ranch. Just this is one in the Redding area. We looked at a similar kind of project, and again, you look at this is probably need to be irrigating line, and as we got into the fall, we could have changed our irrigation rotation a little bit and got by with a little less water, I believe. If you get nothing else out of what I'm gonna share on this irrigated pasture, it's this graph. And this line that's sliding down is the average air temperature throughout the summer at this particular site. If you look at the purple line, what that purple line is what ET is, or what the crop requirement was. You look at this yellow line, and that's how much water was applied after we took out what ran off. And so when you look at this, again, mid-season in the hot summer, Luis had a heck of a time keeping up with crop demand. I mean, a lot of times those yellow lines are below what ET was on that particular ranch. But when we got into the fall, he was irrigating or applying more water than was necessary for crop demand. Again, kind of telling me, boy, if I could do something a little different in that summer, in the late summer, I could save a little water. You can't hardly read this, but this is my wife and I have a small piece of clover in the Redding area. It's irrigated by Anderson Cottonwood Irrigation District. It's a pre-1914 water right, and we got this note the other day in the mail. And it says, it appears that the district's water supply may be reduced by 25%. Even with the current curtailment of 75% supply, we anticipate the ability, blah, blah, blah. Likely scenario is that they're going to reschedule water from the month of October into April and May. And so based on the data I showed you, do you think that's a reasonable strategy? Yeah, I'm really pleased that this is what the district's doing, because I can get by without water in October if I have to. Couple of thoughts, and again, you know, this is about thoughts and ideas. It's not about anybody having a perfect answer. Need to irrigate as close to ET as you possibly can. And again, Gary's not here, but you know, are there some opportunities to maintain the system, tune up the scheduling, where we're not having the runoff that we were seeing? Can we conserve that water some way? And I don't know, because I'm not the full-time professional irrigator. He's been doing it for 30 years, and I'm guessing it's about as good as he can do with the system he has. But again, look at your system. This reduce the land area irrigated as water gets short. Don't try to half irrigate 100 acres. Completely irrigate 50. And then this is a piece, I came across some data, and I'm convinced that this makes sense. If it gets to where you got to dry some ground up, leave 4 to 5 inches of stubble if you can, because that's going to facilitate some fall growth if we get rain or additional water becomes available. And at least in our end of the world on these foothill systems, we see the creeks come up September, October. And maybe it's, you know, I guess now we can talk about maybe it's the marijuana producers are harvesting and aren't taking water. But generally it's a reduction of ET in the uplands, and we see these streams coming up. So might get a little water next year, but don't hold your breath in the fall. Dry matter forage, you know, no surprise to anybody. We grow lots and lots of grass in the early season. Tapers off on a pounds per acre as the season progresses. Again, might be an opportunity here to bank some grass ahead of some livestock for the balance of the summer. Fertilizer, kind of interesting. You know, we got along. This is prices across time. This is actually 2007 data here. We're out here with urea being the blue line, running about $450 a ton. Truck and trailer price. I chatted with somebody that was at a fertilizer conference in Las Vegas the other day and tried to get some idea where urea was going to be. He thought in the $475 range here in the valley. Pasture response to nitrogen fertilizer depends on a bunch of stuff. Single or split app, how's it grazed, what's the fertility. Glenn put this slide up early. This is not a year to make a mistake. Do some soil testing, do some tissue testing. There's a handout that I had. It was in the back. It's got 2 tables on it. That's got the interpretation. If you pull some soil tests, you pull some tissue tests, it has the interpretation of what you might want to add. So this slide just gives you an idea, and this was based on 5 years of data on a foothill ranch in Shasta County. Control plot, urea. This is seasonal production on a pounds per acre basis. Dry matter. Well, we did a couple hundred pounds of urea, a couple hundred pounds of 2100, a couple hundred pounds of 1620. Here's what we got, and this is again 5 years data. The only one we could separate statistically was urea. Throwing 200 pounds of nitrogen, 200 pounds of urea at it, which would break back to about 92 pounds of N. Same ranches. This is just until I was able to pool the data, I couldn't separate them statistically. But here's where we got the growth with the urea: May, June, little bit in July, and then everything flattened off after that. But again, might be a year to think about some nitrogen fertilizers if you had some water to go with it and you applied some grazing management. And I'm hopeful Roger's going to talk about some of that. If we do the math, assuming my source is correct, about $500 a ton, showed we grew about 1,600 to 1,700 pounds more grass. If we figured $500 a ton, use 200 pounds of urea, it'd break back to about $50 an acre. You got a 60% harvest efficiency with cattle, and I just throw that number out. It'd be about $50 an AUM for that 1,000 pounds of dry matter forage added. So again, just something to push the pencil back through. Glenn's going to talk a little bit about some of this later this afternoon. And again, you know, Roger's going to talk a little bit about grazing management. But I think, you know, there are some opportunities to bank some forage on irrigated pasture, but be thinking about with limited water, what's the stubble height. I'm going to have to pull those cattle off and do something else with them in order to preserve these pastures and hope and pray for some fall growth. So my quick summary of ideas: irrigated ET is as much as you can for as long as you can in terms of acreage, and then stop irrigating. Make sure your system's maintained. Look at, if you can, take full water deliveries through the summer. Maybe let some water go in the fall if you can. Don't forget to think about grazing. You know, you shut the water off. You know, it's okay to graze for a while, but you want to leave 4 or 5 inches of plants there so you can get some regrowth, and you're not going to completely graze that field out or damage it to where it's going to be a challenge coming back. And again, you know, might get some fall rain, might get a little more irrigation water in the fall, and then I think do the math about fertilizing in the spring, bank some forage for later use in the season. So I think, again, with irrigated pasture, we got some opportunities to do some things that we don't with the annual rangeland, assuming you get water. Now, Dustin, you told me you think of 30%. Is that what they're telling you?
So far, that's
okay. So 30% on the field station.
Yes. You made, I think, a good point earlier.
Thanks.
You were talking about if you've got a limited allocation of water, do I skip every other irrigation if I'm cutting 50% or irrigate 50% of the acres to the hill? And we talked about it earlier. I think it's worth explaining why you made that assumption, or why that reasoning is.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense to irrigate everything you can at ET, so you're going to get production on those pieces where you can maximize production, let the others go summer dormant, and then hope like hell you get some rain and some water in the fall, and you don't graze it out.
And you mentioned before, so you can shove the water across the field.
Well, yeah, just trying to have a head of water to get it across the field is just a practical matter. You're not gonna push 50 acres worth of water across 100 acres.
Larry?
Yes.
Are there some strategies for dealing with salinity in our water supplies this year?
You know, I'm sorry. Are there some strategies for dealing with salinity in water supplies this year? You know, that's not been an issue in my end of the world, so I don't even have a thought about it.
Okay.
If fertilization is not an option on some leased ground, what's the chances that increased pasture harrowing could help out with that fertilization? Is it worth the cost of the fuel?
You know, for a variety of reasons, if I wasn't going to fertilize, I'd give it a try. You're gonna maybe get some phosphorus out of the deal. You're going to get some potassium, but you're not going to get much nitrogen.
No. Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, does it make sense? Does it make sense to do some pasture harrowing if you're not going to fertilize for whatever the reason? And my response was, going to maybe get some phosphorus. You're going to maybe get some potassium, but you're not going to get much nitrogen. Yes.
Have you guys done any research on the time of irrigation and maybe the efficacy of the absorption if you irrigated, say, at night instead of center of the day, if you had an option to take your water at different times?
You know, I think if you had the option to take water at different times, I haven't, but again, you're probably going to have a little less evaporative loss. But the soil structure is what the soil structure is in terms of take up by the plants, and a lot of it. And I guess, you know, I want to give Gary credit, and I want to give Luis credit at MacArthur Livestock. I mean, those guys, this is a little piece of what they got to manage every day. And so it's got to fit into whatever their whole rotation and work schedule is. And I think that's a challenge as well, is, you know, what can I practically get done? I do see a lot of folks that are on a PG&E bill that are tied into a time of use, and so they do have that built into their schedule, is they shut the pump off because they don't want to pay the penalties when they're pumping on peak.
Okay, thanks, Larry.